I think of like Hobbits, kind of like the edge of Middle Earth and the Shire and living a quiet life.
When I first read the description of Hobbits, it's like, that's the Amish. That's the Amish. I felt suddenly seen and heard in a way that I was not used to being seen and heard. There's something beautiful and hidden that they have that a lot of the rest of the world doesn't have any sense of. It's a little gift to the world.
Welcome to Barrel Age Faith. I've got my good friend, Dr. Stephen Petersheim with us today, and I'm so excited to have him. We met probably 10 years ago, and we got to share our spiritual journeys, and he's got something just really cool to share with you today. He grew up Amish, and so we'll be taking a deep dive into Amish church life. So what was it like growing up Amish?
So there's some things I hated about it and some things I loved about it. One of the big things is sort of the sense of spiritual reality, of the spiritual world being more real than the physical world, almost in a Platonic sense. I think another thing that I really got from that life is being close to nature. I grew up on a farm and we ordered our lives according to the patterns of nature. Another thing that I still carry with me today is in the political realm, the Amish are mostly apolitical. They don't get that involved in political affairs. And in some ways, probably too apolitical, almost too uninvolved. But I did appreciate that the sense of being pilgrims and strangers in this world. And I think one of the things the Amish really try to do is to not let this worldly affairs dictate how they live their lives. And so I think that's a concern that I try to do to live as well. The church was extremely important as sort of a central part of the Amish life. The church was where you would go to make all your decisions about how to shape your life, how to negotiate with modernity, deciding what kinds of technology to use and what kinds not to. So it wasn't an individual decision. And then you'd live with those decisions that you made as a church.
When it comes to like the rules, so many people have questions about how that works. Do they think it's like immoral to have electricity, or why do some Amish men have a smartphone for their business?
I would hesitate to say that I can say this for all Amish that's the same. However, I think the vast majority of them, it would be more as, how would you say, ethical. Is it ethical to do it rather than is it morally right or wrong? So in other words, they wouldn't say it's morally right or wrong to own a car or any of these kinds of modern things, but rather, is it ethical for the kind of community that they want to create? Is it going to enhance that, or is it going to deteriorate that kind of community? It's more, I think, how the majority of them would see it. There are some who talk about modernity and about technology as if that itself is evil, but most of them do not. Rather, does this shape the kind of Christian community?
I really didn't understand that whole dynamic until I joined the Catholic Church. For example, like during Fridays, during our 40 days of Lent leading up to Easter, we have times of fasting. If other people that are not Catholic Christians, if they're not fasting for meat on a Friday, we don't view that as like immoral, like at the same level that you murdered somebody or any type of sin. But for us, we would view it as a violation of our own community and disobeying our leaders and the kind of the lifestyle that we set up. Plus, it's been practiced for 2,000 years, fasting on Fridays. But it's a lifestyle that we believe has been passed on to us. This isn't in like a deep legal sense, but more in the sense of we want to unite ourselves to Christ and his sufferings on these Fridays, in the same way that Sunday is a day celebrating the resurrection. Is it similar to that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You nailed it pretty closely, how it feels to live by Amish rules. Is not everybody who doesn't live by these rules is a wicked sinner or anything like that, but rather that it is not conducive to the Christian community the way we have decided to organize our lives because of our service to God, because of our desire to live a godly life. And so that's, I think, the distinction. And for people who see the rules as completely being about, is this right or wrong, are, I think, missing the rationale for the rules in the first place. I think also there are some Amish even who miss that. And you'll hear some ex-Amish, for example, who talk about those rules as if that's what it meant. But I think that comes from a misunderstanding even within the community sometimes of what those rules really are about. So yeah, I couldn't have put it in better words than you did. So well done.
Well, it's taken time for me to get that. What does a Sunday morning look like?
So one of the things I should clarify here is that I grew up in an Amish community that's a little different from the norm. We had, for example, phones and electricity, but we did use horse and buggy to go to church on Sunday. We used modern machinery on the farm, but then we used horse and buggy for going to church on Sunday. We dressed old fashioned as most of the Amish do. And we also had church buildings. And actually, a lot of the Amish in Pennsylvania, even the most old fashioned among them, some of them will use church buildings. Whereas if you go to Ohio or somewhere like that, Indiana, they don't usually have church buildings. Where I grew up, we had a church building, and we would go, and the church building was less than a quarter mile from my house. So I usually just walked to church. A lot of people would take horse and buggies, walk to church. When you entered the church, it depended what age and gender you were, how you entered the church. If you were a young person, you would wait until the very end, till everybody else was seated to go in. Now, if you were young enough that you needed to go with your parents, you'd go in with your parents. But the people who went in first, it always was a quietness. You'd gather in the stillness of the church. There wasn't a lot of talking and that kind of thing. If you went really early and helped to, stir up the fire. But if you were even within half an hour of the beginning of the service, you would go in and you would sit quietly and sort of meditate, think about God's presence and that kind of thing as you're waiting for the service again. After the youth would file in and sit down, the seating was segregated, so you'd have the men on one side and you have the women on the other side. After the youth filed in, then you'd have a song, and the songs in the Amish church the whole service is in German or a dialect of German, Pennsylvania Dutch. And so the song would be announced by a Quagia. That's a German word. It means wargoer, but it was really like a song leader, sort of like a cantor in Catholic churches. And so you'd have that person who would announce a song, who would lead the song, who would sort of, it wasn't call and response, but the cantor would always be just a half a step ahead of everybody else. The other thing is, in the most traditional services, you would have singing that was very, very slow. If you think of a Benedictine monk chanting, basically, think about that, but slowed down even more than that. That's kind of how Amish singing would sound. The clergy would be outside. When they came in, it was time to end the singing. And so you had kind of the sense that they're out preparing for the service. And when they come in, everyone pays attention and the song comes to. We always had plural clergy. So we had more than one preacher or bishops or whoever.
Would you have bishops and deacons, or bishops and elders, or presbyters and deacons?
There are basically three levels in the Amish churches. The bishops were sort of course, the top, and then you'd have ministers in between, and the deacons were kind of the lowest level. Some deacons were preaching deacons, others were not. That varies from Amish church to Amish church. They would often not do the main service or anything like that. Some churches, they would take care of money issues and that kind of thing.
So is the bishop there every Sunday and kind of the ordinary leader, or do they visit?
In most cases, yes. Where we were, he was always there. But if there were smaller churches that were getting started, or new districts that were being created, then there might be a bishop that is over those new churches as well, or those smaller churches. There's occasionally a church that's small enough that it doesn't ever have its own bishop. When the clergy came in, there would always be a short devotional by one of them. The first prayer was always a kneeling prayer. And so everyone would kneel at the benches, and it was a silent prayer. I may be getting things out of order here a little bit, but I think the first prayer was a silent prayer, silent kneeling prayer, at the end of which clergymen who had started the prayer would say amen. Later on, the main sermon was a lengthy affair usually, and some people would take their morning nap during that. Other people would be listening intently.
What's the typical time frame? I mean, I grew up evangelical, which could mean anywhere between half hour to 45 minutes to a full hour sermon. And now I'm Catholic. It's like, could be anywhere between 5 to 15 minutes.
The short one at the beginning would be more like the 5 or 15 minutes, but the main one could be up to an hour. It usually wasn't quite that long, but it depended. Preachers were more long-winded than others. Our bishop was my favorite. He used our scriptures sometimes to recite Psalms by memory. Also, Martyr's Mirror is kind of an Amish text other than the Bible that would be used fairly regularly. The sense that Amish come from a long line of martyrs as part of their Anabaptist history was important. And so you'd have stories from the Martyr's Mirror that sprinkle in, particularly when it came time for communion. We did high communion twice a year. Right around then, all the traditions kind of be on high alert during this time.
Would it be like Easter and some other time?
That's right. So Easter was the main one, of course, and then you'd have one in the fall as well, usually right around before harvest time. We're around there. So September-ish for Easter. They called it Great Church, I guess. I'm trying to translate the word here, but Great Church, where you basically had a whole day of church. The mornings you'd go through the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the stories of them. Then in the afternoon, you'd go through the Gospels. After that, you would have communion. So you had that twice in the year where you'd have that kind of experience. And so those were times that, again, you were kind of on high alert for the work of God and the presence of God in your midst.
So there was a heightened expectation for the Lord to work within that kind of liturgical cycle.
Absolutely, yeah. And even for the fresh baptism cycles as well, after the spring or after the Easter communion, then there'd be an invitation for people basically to be catechumens, to be instructed in the ways of the church and the ways of God. They would have a season of instruction from basically that communion until the next communion. At the next communion, they'd be baptized the week before the communion.
Oh, yeah. I know of some Catholic churches that do it that way. They kind of have a double cycle. It's most common to do your baptisms at the Easter Vigil, the evening of the resurrection. But for those that are bigger churches, one of my friends was a catechumen, and then he joined like in September, like around St. Michael's feast day.
Yeah, exactly. And that would be basically the same cycle that we would follow.
Would you have celebrated like Pentecost?
Yeah, so you have Pinksondag and Pinksmondag, which is Pentecost Sunday and Pentecost Monday. Both of them would be celebrated. And Pentecost Monday actually was a day when you would go visit friends. It was a holiday as well, so you wouldn't do any work on Pentecost Monday. You would instead go visit people and be celebrating that you're part of the church.
Yeah, I didn't know what Easter Monday was until I became Catholic. You travel back home or you spend time with friends and family. It was a way to kind of keep the thing going.
The day after the holidays of the church, most of which are on Sundays, but sort of the Monday after it, for some of them, were also sort of kept as holidays. One of the exceptions to the Monday thing would be Ascension Day, which was also a big deal, and that's always a Thursday.
Yeah, it's supposed to be Thursday, which is literally 40 days after Easter, the resurrection. You know, all of the traditional Catholics, dioceses, the Eastern Catholics will all still celebrate on Thursday. It's kind of controversial in the West where like most of our bishops and dioceses moved it to the following Sunday. So, I mean, it's not a huge battle, but personally, I would like it to go back to Thursday.
Yeah, well, we still do it that way in the Amish circles. Another holiday, Christmas, there we have kind of the 12 days of Christmas, because you have the Christmas celebration on the 25th, but then we also have in the Amish world, it's called Old Christmas, but it's basically like on January 6th instead, with the three wise men, all that kind of thing. So that whole period is basically a season of holiday for the Amish.
That's great that they call that Old Christmas. When you go back to the ancient church, they probably really had the Epiphany and the celebration of Christ's birth like on the same day, which is normally associated with January 6th. They eventually got split up into two different things. So if you look at like the Christian East or the Orthodox, they're celebrating Jesus' baptism like around the 6th. Where in the West, we're celebrating the three wise men. It's interesting that they use that phrase, Old Christmas. It really says something about the Amish, like their liturgical memory is pretty old.
Yeah. And that's something I think that surprised me when I realized how much of that was just part of how I grew up and how everybody talked about it, then becoming more part of the evangelical world and realizing there's very little of that thought of as an old thing. If it is in the evangelical world, it's thought of as something new. And it's not, it's really old.
I'm going to talk about real quick about high church versus low church, since we're kind of in that area, and then we'll get into the church history side. You said when we first started having these conversations a long time ago that you just didn't even know you were high church growing up Amish until you became evangelical, which tends to be more low church if you're Baptist or non-denominational evangelical. So let's kind of define that. Like, what does it mean to be high church versus low church? You know, church historians are the ones that use this kind of lingo. What's the difference between high church, low church? And then let's talk about the view of Amish sacraments. What do they think's happening during baptism? What do they think's happening during communion? And that can give you a pretty good gauge on how high, they have a view of the sacraments.
Right. One of the intriguing things is the sense that basically having a high respect for the traditions of the church and the high respect for the church as a place where God does his work, or through which God does his work. For the Amish lifestyle, that's kind of a given that, yes, indeed, of course, I need to go to church. It's not just great because I get to hear good sermons or something like that, but it is a place where God meets with his people in a way that is even is heightened during particular practices of the church. We had the idea too that God is at work in the life of the church through the high church, rather than just kind of we're doing our thing and praising God, but rather that somehow the work of the church and the work of God are coincide. And by work, I'm talking about the church.
Is there any kind of like efficaciousness in the sacraments? Is baptism just a sign of what already happened, 2 weeks ago when they accepted Jesus Christ? Which again, that might look different in the Amish community. But is baptism like, let's say, regenerational, where it's kind of like marriage? As an evangelical, marriage would still be kind of sacramental in the sense of I'm not married, and then in this ceremony we become married and become one flesh. Like it's an event that's also does something in the eyes of God through his action.
I think with both baptism and communion, there'd be a sense of that kind of action happening, and I think the marriage illustration that you gave, I think that's a really good description of it, because it is something that you don't take lightly or see simply as a symbolic thing of something that's already happened. For baptism in particular, I still remember when I was baptized in the Amish church that there was a sermon about how being baptized is part of the new birth. There was no talk like you hear in some evangelical circles of it's a sign of what has already happened. You're already regenerated, and now it's a sign of what's happened. No, in the Amish church, it was a part of your new birth. The language of new birth was used, but not in the sense of being born again as a private event that might happen somewhere, but rather as I am experiencing the fullness of the new birth. Or the new birth is partly happening as I am baptized. And so that's one of the things, certainly for baptism, not something that is a light matter at all. And then for communion as well, you would have the sense that here, if you come to church to participate in the life of Christ, you must partake of communion in order to fully partake of Christ. That there is an actual participation in Christ that happens through communion that is not, again, just a symbol of, we accept what Christ has done for us. Yeah, they would say that too, but there's a sense that in communion itself, there is a participation in the body. There you had that. You also had, for the Amish communion service, there'd also be foot washing and almsgiving were considered very much part of the high communions of the church. And so those, though, were seen more as communion with your fellow man or woman, whereas the bread and the wine were much more seen as communion with God and participating with God, taking in his body. Blood.
Yeah, that's pretty unique to hear foot washing kind of elevated as almost like a sacrament or like an important rite in the church. We do it like on Holy Thursday before Easter, kind of Last Supper night when Jesus would have actually done that. And so it's cool to hear that has been preserved in your tradition. Oh, I was going to just push you a little bit on like distinctions with communion, and the Amish may not even make the kind of distinctions that you find in kind of these Catholic Protestant sort
Right.
of thematic debates, but would they view your partaking in Christ's presence when you receive the bread and the wine? Are the bread and the wine themselves experiencing any kind of transformation like that you would see in like the Lutheran world, Orthodox Catholic world? Of course, Catholics and Orthodox are going to say it differently than Luther did, but Luther would still say that there was a transformation happening, like the bread and the wine receive the fiery presence of Christ, and his physical body and blood are also truly present. And so that tends to be like the most extreme Protestants will go, though you'll find some Anglicans going a little bit further.
It's a good question. I hadn't heard the language of transubstantiation or I can't remember the Lutheran term, but similar terminology. I hadn't heard any of that terminology as an Amish kid growing up. What it was usually presented as was sort of a miracle. So they didn't talk about it so much in terms of how did it happen, but rather the sense that miraculously somehow we are taking in the body and blood of Christ. In other words, these aren't just words that have symbolic meaning alone, that somehow we are partaking of the body and blood of Christ. And so they kind of let it at that. That's all they said. When I later became aware of the debates about transubstantiation, I realized, the Amish, in a sense, are not saying for sure they believe one way or the other, but rather saying it to say, no, we believe what God says when he says that this is, or when Christ says, this is my body, let's partake of my body in order to part of me. So I, as a kid, I remember wondering how, my parents were partaking of communion, and I was wondering, do they taste blood and do they taste, meat and that kind of thing? And so I was kind of mystified about this as a kid. Even growing up, it's like, because of the way it's talked about, it's a mystery of the faith. And actually, they would use the word mystery.
Yeah, I mean, mystery is the Greek word for sacrament. I mean, that's the original word. Our Greek-speaking Catholics and Orthodox would use mysterion, mystery, and gets translated into Latin into sacrament. So to hear that they use the word mystery, yeah, it means they're tapping into that same ancient language. So if I had like an A, B, C option, like the Catholic and Orthodox perspective, the Lutheran, or like the Calvin would be like, you get taken up to heaven when you spiritually partake of his body and blood. I wonder if they would circle A, B, and C, or if they would just circle like A, B, or C, like one of the options.
One of them might circle different ones.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good question, because there are some Amish who have been much more influenced by sort of evangelical speaking about it. And so there are some Amish who might suggest that it is just a symbol, but that would not be the norm. And so to suggest that it's only a symbol would be like cutting out the heart of it for some people.
Like something mystical, something you're taking into a real participation in him, in his own divine life. Now, would Amish views be written down a lot? Like, is there a lot of writing, or does it tend to be more of like this oral memory? So like even like what communion is would be more of this oral transmission of passing down.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's much more the oral tradition. And it's one of the things that I've studied the oral tradition as a literary person. I've studied the oral tradition. So I've been amazed by how many things I understand about the oral tradition because of my background. There's almost an aversion to writing it down. One of the reasons is they don't want it to be held up as the word of God unless they're very sure that it is. And so there's a bit of an aversion to that. That said, there are Amish prayer books and Amish hymnals, well, not hymnals, lead us songbooks where they do have things written down. But as far as even things like sermons, they're not going to write those down. The Amish traditions, those are not going to be written down. And part of it is that there's a sort of incarnational sense of what it means to be a human. If you are doing it by words on a page, you risk missing the reality of it. So even like the idea of the word of God, the idea that if you are only looking at the Bible as a word of God, you miss the living word of God. You miss Christ himself as the living word of God. And so there's a sense that the written language can become idolatrous, a point of idolatry. And so there's almost an aversion to putting too much into words on a page.
Surprisingly, when you study oral tradition, it's proven itself to actually be a pretty stable, and in some cases more stable than writing stuff down.
I mean, just take the Amish culture, for example. It's more stable. It's not written down, but it's more stable than a lot of the churches that I've attended where, boom, one thing can happen one day and the next thing, another thing. Whereas for the Amish, change comes slowly, and in part because you have to sift it through not just the people who are there present with you, but all the people who have sort of set it up, all the people who have thought through tradition. I was thinking a little bit about how the Amish tradition formed and all that. And I think a lot of it, there's a sense that tradition is important because you are also paying attention to others who thought about this before you did, and you're taking them into consideration, letting them be part of the church, even if because you're dead doesn't mean you're not part of the church anymore.
Yeah, Chesterton says the democracy of the dead. They should all have a vote.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking of Chesterton when I said that, the democracy of the dead.
Tradition. It's a huge word. I'm sure cherished to Amish. Growing up evangelical, you generally view the word tradition as a bad thing. You think of Jesus saying, "Oh, you hold to the traditions of men, have forgotten like the word of God." What's interesting is like when you look at the NIV Bible and a lot of English Bibles, they translate that consistently, that Greek word, into tradition, like in a negative sense. But then in the other part, I think it's in Thessalonians, where Paul basically says, hold on to the traditions that we've like passed on to you. And it's the same Greek word, but a lot of times in the NIV and the English Bibles, they don't translate that word into tradition. What we handed on to you is what it'll say instead of the word tradition. So there can be this, like, because of those translations, this like disdain for the word tradition, as if, oh, if you use that word, it's only men. But no, there's apostolic tradition. And that's something that if you negate, if you don't hold on to, that's a bad thing, because it's from Christ and the apostles.
There was in the Amish world a reverence for tradition. The idea that tradition was bad is something I had to learn from others. Not that I never heard it before. I mean, because you're right, Christ does warn against misuse of tradition, and even in the Amish world, we'd hear that. But for the Amish, the much greater thing was holding on to the tradition that we have received, has been passed down. That the apostles had a huge part in creating that tradition.
So where did the Amish come from? Did it go from like, Apostle Peter and the apostles to Amish? Are they a proto-Protestant group, like before the Reformation? Did they come about after the Reformation?
Yes. Well, you could get one of three different answers. Some of them would say, yes, we are children of the Reformation. We were one of the Protestant groups. That, however, is within the Amish world is sort of a minority opinion. Most of the Amish would see themselves more in the pattern of proto-Protestants. So Waldensians, Albigensians, all those kinds of groups. So if you I mentioned the Martyr's Mirror earlier, if you look in there, they definitely take a proto-Protestant kind of view of the Amish or of Anabaptists in general. And there you have them connecting it to fringe groups within the Catholic Church all along. And then if you go back far enough, you have the first martyrs show up in the Martyr's Mirror is the apostles themselves. Every apostle, how they died is recorded in the Martyr's Mirror. And different martyrs throughout time. So the famous, one of the famous ones, I am forgetting the names, Felicia, maybe. There's two women who are martyred in the church.
I've heard Felicity. It can probably get translated different ways.
The Martyr's Mirror almost makes it sound like if you are not being martyred, you better be questioning your Christianity. If nobody in your circle is being martyred, you better be questioning your Christianity. Are you actually following Christ? But like I say, there are some of them that are not mainstream Catholicism, but certainly within sort of the structures of Catholicism, at least at the fringes of Catholicism. A lot of these groups existed. Some of them were considered heretical eventually. Some of them were not. But a lot of them sort of take that proto-Protestant view of their beginnings. There's a third view, too, that's sometimes taken up. Some of them would connect it a little bit more with Zwingli's Reformation in some ways. Because of what happened to Protestants during the Reformation, what happened to Anabaptists during the Reformation, that really drew attention to them, and they were sometimes called the Radical Reformation, which suggests that they grew out of the Reformation.
I would hesitate to throw them in the Radical Reformation, partly because of like how the first part of our conversation, how that went, where there's a little bit of this higher understanding of sacraments and liturgy and all that. Not to say that Zwingli and them didn't have a little bit of that, but there was a greater emphasis on just the symbol and a disdain for certain types of feast days and things like that. I was interested to hear, where did the word Anabaptist come from? Because that word in itself, I think, was given to, like, they didn't give themselves Anabaptist. That normally is given to them by the groups that are killing them.
Literally, it meant rebaptism, not anti-baptism. It's Anabaptism. Basically, it was the idea that they were being baptized in modern lingo on their confession of their faith. It was a sense that their baptism as babies, because most of them would have been baptized as babies at the beginning. And so their baptism as babies, some of them not seeing that as valid anymore, or because they didn't themselves choose it, that it wasn't real in a sense. The idea of Anabaptism came from the sense that a baptism, be valid, had to be on the person's own confession of faith, rather than their parents speaking for them or inducting them into the church on their own. For most of the Anabaptists, that meant being baptized as an adult, at least in the sense that you're old enough to make decisions by yourself. So how baptism would be considered legitimate by them either. So, but that's where it comes from.
So are they claiming that in the 10th century they were baptizing adults, or they weren't, but they felt like that was an abuse and they're restoring what it should be?
Yeah. Well, and there a little bit of both. So if you take St. Augustine, for example, you have St. Augustine, who is not baptized until he is older because he's afraid he'll sin, and he wants to wait until he's not going to sin anymore. So his baptism really is legitimate. So they would point to examples like him and say, there's proof that through time that not everybody in the church thought you should baptize babies. And so there's that sense. There's also, I think, the sense that they are restoring it to how it was intended to be. And there's a lot of talk about baptism as a thing that, to be valid, must be done by the individual.
Lutherans were still baptizing babies. Calvin and the Presbyterians and the Reformed were still baptizing babies. And so the Anabaptists really stuck out. So they were an easy group to persecute, which definitely started happening at really high rates during the Reformation. Of course, Catholics are guilty of killing lots of different kinds of Christians. But I think there's been some studies to show that Luther and Calvin killed way more Anabaptists than Catholics. So you never want to throw the Catholics under the bus that we were the only ones killing people.
No, absolutely not. No, there's a sense that if anything, the Lutherans probably would have killed more Anabaptists than any other group, partly because they're both in Germany. The majority of them would have been in Germany.
In northern Germany, right? Like they're both
Right.
probably more in that.
That's right.
Northern Germany, whereas
Yes.
southern Germany pretty much stayed more Catholic in the Bavarian
Right.
region.
Yeah, that's right. There's an old saying. My uncle repeated it. He said, this was what my grandpa said. He's like, Luther may have killed my ancestors, but he gave us the Bible. And so, because they would use the Luther Bible, of course. So the idea was that, yes, there was a problem. In the sense, the rest of the Christian world was persecuting us, was killing us for not doing it their way. I think the Amish stand out, or the Anabaptists in general stand out, because they didn't take that approach. That is something that I value about my Amish background, is that I do come from a tradition where that was early on seen as something that is not a good Christian practice to have.
It gets messy when we talk about the relationship between state and church. Early in the interview, you're almost saying, yeah, they're almost so withdrawn that they don't even engage it, but there's also this other side to it where during the Reformation, throughout most of church history, there was no not working with the empire or not working with a nation or state. That was the only way to actually literally survive, was to have people protecting you, because there was no like modern separation of church and state. Or if there was, maybe in certain parts of history, it was more like you're a minority group and we're going to protect you. Like the Assyrian Church of the East and the Persian Empire, they were never a majority, never had collaboration really so much with the empire. They were always a minority, but they had times where they were protected.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the things too is that one of the phrases that the Amish use a lot is being the quiet of the land, like wanting to be able to live in peace with others and be peaceful people in the land. There is a sense of we're not so concerned about the polis, about the state of, about the city, about good of the people, as far as it's enforced, but we do want the peace of the people. So there's kind of that sense that they want both, and unfortunately, in this world, it's hard to really have both.
Yeah, Philip Jenkins, a historian, said that Christians know exactly what they're supposed to do when they're the minority, but when we become the majority and are in charge of like the government and in charge of things, then we don't know how to act, because that whole model of Jesus, pray for your enemies, if you're being persecuted, turn your cheek.
And I think because the Amish were so used to being a minority group, the idea of even trying to take some control as far as the city is concerned was just not really even part of the equation for them. That created sort of political quietism to such a degree that, again, it's sort of like we want the peace of the city, but we're not willing to do anything to take anything by force, and therefore it might happen, it might not.
I think of like Hobbits, kind of like the edge of Middle Earth and the Shire and the living a quiet life. I think Tolkien really valued that the thing that the Amish value and Anabaptist tradition values. I think Tolkien really valued himself as he watched industry destroy so much and experiencing World War I or World War II. I'm very attracted to kind of the peacemaking, pacifist kind of Anabaptist style of doing things.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned Tolkien and the Hobbits. When I first read the description of Hobbits, it's like, that's the Amish. That's the Amish. I just kind of felt suddenly seen and heard in a way that I was not used to being seen and heard when I read that his description of the Hobbit. Now there were some things that didn't ring true of the Amish experience, but certainly that sort of lifestyle, and also there's something beautiful and hidden that they have that a lot of the rest of the world doesn't have any sense of. It's just almost like it's a little gift to the world, and a gift, I think, to Christianity, to say, oh, wait a minute, there is a way other than violence as a way to do Christ's work on earth.
Amen. I'm all aboard on that. When you look at the monastic tradition in Catholic Christianity and Eastern Orthodoxy and all the other groups too, you see that kind of same value. They really weren't the ones that were controlling the empire. I mean, of course, they had some alliances, but a lot of times they were on the countryside. And you go to Mount Athos, where there's like this monastic island out by Greece, and they're living off the land, they're growing food. They look like a very peaceful people. And they're not looking to start wars. Even, monks are forbidden from really waging wars, particularly in the East. There's canons against that. I think we do see these values all throughout any Christian tradition that you look at, but they can be easily lost, compromised. And that's the real battle.
Yes, I watched the movie A Hidden Life recently. I don't know if you've heard of it or not. If not, you definitely need to go watch it. But basically, there's a Catholic. Oh, I can't remember the name of the order that he's part of, but it is a order. It's not a monastery because he's actually married and they're part of society. It's one I had to look up because I didn't know any details about. He does very much have the kind of ethos that you'd have in an Amish community. It's a wonderful, wonderful film, and it really captures, I think, some of the Amish way of resistance by lifestyle, not by force.
I think when we're doing things really well is when we look to our monasteries and the monasteries are functioning well. They're the place of stability, orthodoxy, showing us like what the liturgical life looks like, fasting, charity, what it means to be a Christian. And so when those are all working really well, you know what you're supposed to do, like a Catholic parish and a Catholic individual and family who maybe are all living around the monastery, these villages. They know how to live, like they're surrounded around the mountain. But when we get really caught up in looking at the Vatican, for example, the Vatican can do many great things quickly, but just as quickly as it can do great things, it also can be a political, messy affair. If you're like on the Catholic news cycle every day, just like studying the Vatican, you're probably not going to have a real exciting spiritual life.
I can't remember the monk at this point, but who went to Rome and was horrified by the abuses he saw there in Vatican. And I don't remember which period this was, but then he starts a monastic order, a famous one, but I can't remember who said, I'll trust.
Probably St. Dominic.
Yeah, it probably is St. Dominic.
Yeah, Luther had the same experience too. Many holy men who'd go to Rome had the same experience. And oftentimes they'd start a religious order and be like, okay, I got to rebuild the church. God's going to do something special to reform and renew.
Luther wasn't the first one who had that experience. He happened to start the Reformation out of it, but I think it was a common experience. And I think the beautiful thing about it is when they go and have that experience, but then they also see the beauty of Christ in the midst of all of that.
So Amish and most Anabaptists generally, they don't sign up for war.
I think you had mentioned something about do they have guns and that kind of thing. It's not for war. They would go hunting. So there is hunting within the Amish community. And so having guns for food, but not guns that would be used to kill people. And so you wouldn't go to war. You wouldn't have handguns and that kind of thing normally, because those would be used to kill people, not animals. If you would be going to war, you'd be kicked out of the Amish church.
I have a good friend who I taught with at our Catholic school, and he's a devout Quaker. And it was a very challenging time during Vietnam. He got criminally charged. He was in court, and he was like one of the first ones in the nation to get acquitted. And he didn't have to go fight in Vietnam. And so he'd come in and tell his story to my classroom, because we'd be talking about like the challenging between like just war theory and peacemaking, and how do you live the Christian life when we're living in such a fallen, violent world. If someone broke into an Amish person's house, is the dad going to go grab his gun? What are they going to do? It's the same type of principle, right? Like, it's just we're talking about more people. I would wonder what they would do.
Yeah, no, the answer there is no. They would not. I mean, they would not be expected to, at least as an Amish person. I'm not saying they never would, but as an Amish person, the correct answer would be no, I will not do that. There's actually a story when America had a lot of frontier and Indians and white men were fighting. And there was a village where the Indians came in and captured a lot of people and killed a lot of people and that kind of thing. But then there's this one family who left the latchkey out to signal that they can come in, and refuse to do anything to protect themselves. And that family was saved. And so the Indians didn't kill that family. And so that story is one of those stories that circulates among the Amish community quite a bit. It's like, no, even for self-defense, do not do this. It is better to die than to kill someone else. And that's sort of a big part of the ethos is, no, I am ready to give up my life, but I am not ready to kill anyone else.
That's a beautiful story and very powerful. And I think there's a lot of truth in it too. Andy Griffith didn't carry a gun, and he had a very peaceful Mayberry. He's kind of a similar model. St. Francis walked across, to meet the Sultan. There is like this peacemaking tradition in the Franciscan Church within the Catholic Church of, we had all these crusades to win the Holy Land back, and they all basically in the end didn't work out. But it was Francis who was this peacemaker who talked to the Sultan, walked barefoot to him. And he's the one that ended up with the keys to the Holy Land. They gave the Franciscans like, hey, yeah, have access to your churches. And the Franciscans have been there ever since. And so there is something to be said about that truth that Jesus passes on to us.
Exactly. I love the St. Francis comment of Dante picks up on that in the Divine Comedy. I was reading through that recently again, and I was like, wait a minute, I forgot this was in here, but basically him meeting the Sultan is mentioned right in there. And I was like, wow, this is an amazing story, because it really does, for Dante, it does the work of showing what it means to have a real Christ-like heart versus some of the other people who were actually trying to do by force what Francis did peacefully.
Dante is good about showing the complexities of Catholicism, because he puts a pope in hell, the bottom pit. And then he puts this peacemaking Francis, up top. And so we're not an uncritical tradition or just like listening to our higher ups no matter what. Like, no, there's a true apostolic passing on of what it means to be a Christian. It's just when you've got 1.2 billion people in the world, it gets complicated. In the ancient church, the early church, the Christians didn't typically sign up to fight for the Roman Empire.
And the Amish definitely tell that story repeatedly. I do think the question of disassociating Christianity from empire was really heavily on Christians' minds at the beginning. And then it became part of it, but it's also like, wait a minute, do we want to step back and say, well, the empire shouldn't be Christian? We don't want to say that either. And so I think that's where a lot of questions entered in, that the early church didn't have to deal with because there was no sense that they would become empire at the very beginning.
The empire did serve a purpose for establishing like canonical boundaries on like this is what Christianity is, and like Arianism's not, which Arianism was gigantic. People kind of forget that it wasn't like a small little side story. Northern Europe was dominated by the Arian crisis all the way up until like Charlemagne, and he kind of used violence to change the picture.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking about the fact that there are several formulas that are used a lot in the Amish world, particularly in their ceremonies. And one of them is the Trinitarian formula in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I hadn't really connected it sort of with what happened historically there. But as you say that, it's like, wait a minute. They're clearly laying down that we are a Trinitarian group. We are not one of the Arians. And so it is kind of interesting to notice that they do adopt this. Another formula that is still really important in the Amish community is connecting themselves to Abraham. They will often say things in the name of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. I think it is interesting, though, to think about how church history has shaped all of our groups, and even in ways like this that I never even thought about.
It's always a messy picture because you may not have done the violence yourself to keep these groups at bay, but you still are somehow benefiting.
That's right. One of the questions, the hard questions for pacifists is always like, well, wait a minute. I'm not willing to fight, but yet I get the benefits of other people fighting for me. And so I think that makes it hard to just say I'm a pacifist. That's it.
We did touch on this already, but I just wanted to briefly talk about it real quick. The German heritage, Old German is still like the language of the liturgy. Is that how Amish talk to each other, like at home, like day to day, or is that more just liturgical?
It's a little more liturgical. The day-to-day talk would be a dialect of German. So it's been inflected by English. At my house, if you were outside the house, the language was English. But if you were inside the house, the language was Pennsylvania Dutch. When they talk about people who are not Amish, it's English versus us. So I talk about the English. They're really talking about anyone who's not Amish. It might be Indian. It might be Asian, Chinese, whatever. Might not know a word of English, but we still would call them English because they're not Amish.
What was that like to leave the Amish world? I'm sure that's a big question people want to hear.
Yeah. No. For me, it was much simpler than for a lot of people, because a lot of people, if you leave the Amish world, you are going to be excommunicated and you are going to be disowned. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that some Amish communities consider your baptismal vows to the Amish church in particular. Where I was, that was not so much the case. Yes, there were baptismal vows. I had the same kinds of vows. The understanding was that those vows are, first of all, to Christ rather than to the Amish church. And yes, to the church, but to the church at large, in a sense. So for me, there wasn't a sense in the community that I'm breaking my baptismal vows by leaving the church. In my community, excommunication was saved for very rare cases, was not just the norm for anyone who left the Amish faith, but rather a sense of if God's calling you somewhere else, Godspeed to you. For me, it was free. I actually lived at home for a while after I was not Amish anymore, and there was no problem with that. My parents were both very supportive, and a lot of the community was as well. I still have had a great relationship with the Amish bishop, for example. He's a wonderful man of God. He passed on a number of years ago. But for me, it was not a difficult thing. But for many Amish, it is because of the excommunication. It may also tend to be more charitable toward the Amish than some ex-Amish are. Some of them are very bitter because of how they left.
Well, how could you not have strong emotional reaction to losing family in your whole community? That would be very painful.
I think one of the difficulties about speaking about the Amish is it's not a monolithic community. I mean, to the outside world, they all look like they're doing sort of the same thing. But when you're within the community, it's like there's so many variations within the Amish world. There's New Order Amish, there's Old Order Amish, there's New Order Amish. There's just different styles of being Amish. And some of them are in the Old Order tradition, are extremely upset whenever you change any tradition, whereas others are much more loose in some areas than New Order Amish. Amish in Ohio and Amish in Pennsylvania, they don't do things quite the same. Amish in Ohio, who are in Old Order, have no problems doing things together. Amish in Pennsylvania, they have a great problem doing anything together. There's a lot of variation within them. And my answers here are based a lot on my own experience. I was a fringe member of a fringe community at the fringes of a fringe community.
The edge of the Amish empire. I shouldn't say empire with Amish. It doesn't go together. Is there any such thing as like a non-Christian Amish, or like all Amish really practicing Christians? I mean, is that pretty much, integrated into what it means to be Amish?
Yes and no. I think that's a more complex question than it might seem. And one of the reasons is that the Amish tend to use different language for talking about Christianity than what we hear in most other circles, to the extent where they're not very quick to call themselves Christians, but that doesn't mean they would not think of themselves as Christians. A lot of them would talk more about themselves as followers of Christ or attempting to follow Christ, ordering their lives around an attempt to follow Christ. There's some Amish that the cultural side of being Amish is really the important thing rather than the religious component. And so for some of them, they would, live as the Amish live, do as the Amish do, even speak as the Amish speak, but that they wouldn't necessarily adopt sort of the common language of Christianity, mostly keep those thoughts to themselves and just nod their heads and go along.
We met in 2012. I think it was around 2012. I had just become Catholic, I'm pretty sure. You guys had moved to Richmond. You were a professor of English, and we got to enjoy each other there. And then you had like this call to kind of really enter into like ministry life. Just briefly, what's it been like since leaving Richmond, going to Gordon-Conwell?
So I was Baptist non-denominational for a while, sort of a mixture of those at different places. And then in Massachusetts, where I went to seminary, I was part of a Congregationalist church. There's more liturgy there. Now I'm down here in Georgia and I'm part of a Christian Missionary Alliance church. One of the things that really drew me to the Christian Missionary Alliance is they have a sense of worldwide Christianity, and Christianity is not just for one part of the globe. Christian nationalism is something that's infected parts of the evangelical church that really trouble me. And with the Alliance, I have felt that is not as big a problem. Now I'm teaching at a Christian liberal arts college, so I'm able to combine my love of literature and my love of theology. Just last semester, for example, I was teaching a class in science fiction and theology, and it was great. At IU, when I was a professor in a state school, I also taught a science fiction class, but here I was able to directly bring in theology as well, and just a fantastic time.
You went to Gordon-Conwell, big
Yes.
famous seminary here in the United States. Did you have any favorite professors or like courses?
Right. Well, yeah, I had some really good professors there. Don Fairbairn is a professor. He's actually from the Charlotte campus, but he is the head of the Cooley Center for Early Christianity. He's basically the head of a Protestant Center for Study of Patristics. And that, of course, has been a traditionally weak area for a lot of Protestant seminaries. I really like that. How was ancient Christianity, and seeing some similarities between ancient Christianity and the Amish that I didn't see in other sort of more contemporary forms of Christianity. And so I think looking at sort of the roots of Christianity and thinking about how Christianity had been formed, that really helped me a lot. But he taught one of my church history classes, and we looked at both Eastern and Western writers. And so I really gained an appreciation for the Orthodox. Had always loved the idea of theosis, but theosis is one of his favorite terms, the idea of participating with God, and that being really what it means to be a follower of Christ. I loved all of my theology classes. I had great professors from different places around the world. I have a hard time saying which one was my favorite.
It's just like your kids. You just say they're all my favorite.
Exactly.
One last question, and then you can talk about the books that you've written. We had a lot of conversations about Catholic Christianity and the ancient church, one of my favorite topics. I recall you saying that when you were at Baylor, where you got your Ph.D., that there were a lot of people that were like in the English department that became Catholic while you were there. You saw kind of a movement there, that you even had friends who were in the Anglican ordinariate, which would be, for those that don't know, would be like Anglican and Christians or Episcopalians who entered into the Catholic Church, but they got to keep their Anglican or Episcopalian Church of England heritage. It's kind of like just being Anglican, but you're in the Catholic Church. And so you said you had some friends that were in that at Baylor. Have you ever explored becoming Catholic or Orthodox, or like considered them ever?
Great, wonderful question.
No
Of course.
small question, the last one.
Definitely. definitely have considered that. I think one of the things there is that Protestants are much weaker when it comes to things like understanding tradition in a healthy way and understanding what role tradition has to play and who we are as Christians. I think there are certainly groups of Protestants who are getting better at it than they were at one point, but I do think that is a weakness generally speaking. I also think that there's an awful lot Protestant groups have cut themselves off from by cutting off the Catholic Church. The first time I really thought about this was when I was talking to my brother-in-law, who's Amish to this day. I was talking to him and I was saying something about, that we were talking about church splits. The Amish have church splits regularly, just like Baptists or any other group. I was talking about them and saying, sometimes they're necessary. And my brother-in-law was like, well, they're never to be celebrated. Like, it's not fun when the body of Christ gets cut up. And I said, well, would you say the same thing about the Reformation? Because I was just thinking, the Reformation is given. And he was like, well, Luther didn't have to split from the church. And I was kind of taken aback. I was just a kid at the time. I was taken aback to hear someone suggest that the Protestant Reformation didn't need to happen. But now I'm totally where my brother-in-law was back then. And so now I'd be like, I wish that we would all be one. And I do think even not being all as one, today we're in a healthier place in the sense that we are learning from each other in a way that longer ago we were just fighting each other. Even when we weren't killing each other, we were still just fighting each other. I love, for example, what you're doing here by bringing Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic places together for chats. I don't think that was happening much in the past. And so that is a kind of togetherness that we have today that wouldn't have been happening nearly as much in the past. I've kind of evaded truly answering your question about becoming Catholic and about becoming Orthodox. My best answer right now is I go where I sense God calling me at the time. My answer for now.
I hope that would be your answer always. Yeah. I go where the Lord leads me. Any other answer would be pretty lame. I just bring it up because it's a popular topic. I think you see a lot of people wrestling with these bigger questions now. We have such an overwhelming amount of information coming our way. You could just spend all day reading texts and ancient materials that we never really had access to in our own language. And so there's like this just endless potential for learning, which is both beautiful and causes anxiety.
Right. And I do think, especially some of my friends who were evangelical and became Catholic later, I really think, like grad school friends from Baylor, I think some of that happens because people who have been closed off from hearing what Catholics think, except to say what bad things they think, and often stereotypes of Catholics or that kind of thing, when they suddenly hear someone presenting the message of Christ or a part of the message of Christ through a Catholic lens, it suddenly opens our eyes to, there's a new and different way of thinking about this. And it's a sincere and genuinely trying to follow Christ approach. It's not just someone who's like trying to make up excuses for doing it a different way. And I think that is part of it. I think the other thing, though, is, as I was mentioning earlier, that have done a much better job of understanding and of sifting through the church tradition than a lot of Protestants have. That is a definite treasure that's in the Catholic Church that I definitely see the reasoning for that. Like I said, I only am where I am because I sense God called me here for now, and who knows where He'll call me in the future.
One of the things I think brings unity to people is when we study the ancient church together. There's also praying and worshiping together too. There's a cool group out in Kansas called the Eighth Day Institute, started by some Orthodox guys. They have this gathering called the Great Hall of Men where they study the ancient church texts together. There's Orthodox, Catholics, and Protestants. They also do like a prayer in like a Vespers, just kind of praying an evening prayer together. There are these forms that are out there where I think good things are happening. We'll see what happens at the Barrel Age Faith. Maybe we'll try something out too.
It's great. My nephew is actually a college student at Friends University. It's a Quaker college out there, but he is actually heavily involved in that scene. It's loving it all the time. He chats with me and lets me know what's going on. He is, by the way, the son of that Amish man that I talked about earlier, my brother-in-law, who said, well, maybe it wouldn't have been such a bad thing if the Catholic Church, Protestant Reformation. Um, and then I also have a number of other friends who are involved. Great stuff. Thank
That's
you, Kyle.
cool. You know, Rich Mullins, he's kind of a local hero around here in Richmond, Indiana. He was Quaker, but when he was going to the Friends School, the Friends University in Wichita, he was also going through RCIA at the Catholic Church. From one of the Catholic priests there, he was really up and down about it over and over and over again. But right before he died in a tragic Jeep accident, according to this priest, had decided he was going to join the Catholic Church and had his day picked out, but he died before he was able to do that. And so you saw someone even like Rich Mullins' group, Quaker, which has some Anabaptist roots, right? Yeah. Um,
I know.
you see him kind of wrestling with like these values of peacemaking. For him, the Franciscan tradition really combined like that Anabaptist peacemaking connected to the land, and then also kind of having this historical connection to like liturgy, the sacraments, Eucharist. And so you see these people really wrestling with like, what does it mean to be a Christian? Like an all-encompassing Christian, not just a mere Christian.
No, that's good. I think also, I probably told you, I actually taught Rich Mullins' brother when I was out there when I was in Indiana. His brother still lives in the area, and he was one of my students. But anyway, I think Rich Mullins is a great example of someone who does really try to go back and understand Christianity as a whole. I also really like his music had sort of a folk twang to it a bit. I really like that sort of that genuine authenticity in his approach. It really felt like he's trying to capture the essence of Christianity, and that's something that stayed with me.
Dr. Stephen Petersheim, thanks for coming on the show. One last plug. What are some of the books that you've written?
The most recent one is a book on Hawthorne, actually, Rethinking Nature. It's basically an eco-critical take on Hawthorne's writing, which basically for eco-criticism, we're looking at how do literature and the environment come together. And so thinking about Hawthorne as a nature writer, which I position that in the tradition of nature writers. In there, I do have a little bit of eco-theology that I have as well. That's one of my books. I have also a book on 19th century writers and nature. Again, my Amish background sort of got me thinking in that direction. And one of my friends from grad school was a big Wendell Berry fan. I also have a book on science fiction and theology that I'm in the process of writing right now. But then I have a number of articles also on Native Americans, like a little tiny bit of Native American blood possibly in me. According to family legends, at least. I have done a bit of research on Native Americans as well, and looking at their views of the land. Those are my writings.
Can they buy it on Amazon?
Yeah, if you want to get my books, they're on Amazon.
I'm going to have you back on when you publish your next book on theology and science fiction, because that's a personal favorite of mine. Thank you so much for coming on the show, guys. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so we can get barrel-aged faith out to more people. Support Dr. Stephen Petersheim by checking out his works, and keep him in your prayers, his ministry, his family, as they continue to do God's work. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys again next time.
Thank you, Kyle. Take care.